depending on where you're calling in from, or good afternoon. My name is Terri Yellowhammer, and I'm really excited to be with you today. I hope that wherever you're calling in from that you're having a lovely day. I'm here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and it's sunny, and I'm happy again to talk with you today about child welfare issues and domestic violence cases, addressing the unique needs of American Indian and Alaska Native families. You probably read a little bit about me today in my bio, but I am an enrolled member of the Standing Rock Lakota Nation of North and South Dakota. I'm also Anishinaabe. My mother is an enrolled member of the White Earth Nation in northern Minnesota. So with that, we'll get started. The Resource Center on Domestic Violence, Child Protection and Custody is a project of the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. The Special Interest Resource Center, or SIRC, is funded by the Department of Health and Human Services. It provides training and technical assistance on national, regional, state, and local levels in areas around the intersection of domestic violence and child protection and child custody. Our learning objectives today, it's my hope that you will understand some of the common issues and concerns associated with Indian Child Welfare Act cases when domestic or intimate partner violence is the reason children are removed. I hope that you'll learn about statutory requirements of the Indian Child Welfare Act and how they might impact intimate partner violence or domestic violence cases. I hope that you'll understand how American Indian history, trauma, and resilience can inform new ways to engage communities and non-traditional partners to assist Native families. And I thought it might be interesting to have a little poll just to let me know what your familiarity is with American Indians or Alaska Natives. And the questions that I'm asking you to respond to is, are you familiar with the history of American Indians, Alaska Natives? Do you know a little bit about them? Or do you know very little or almost nothing? So the votes are coming in. It looks like folks are mostly familiar. Some know a little. A few folks know almost nothing. They're still coming in. And it looks like it's evening out somewhat between knowing a little bit about American Indians and Alaska Natives and folks being more familiar. So the poll is closed, and it looks like 56% of you are familiar with the history of American Indians and Alaska Natives. So that's very encouraging. So thank you for taking that poll. So defining exposure to intimate partner violence. A quick note on intimate partner violence and how that differs from domestic violence. A helpful definition that I found is use of the term intimate partner violence is to move us away from the old view that abusive violence only occurs in marital relationships where the husband was the abuser and the wife was the victim. The concept of intimate partner violence, I think, occurred, around the year 2000, and that acknowledges that abuse can exist in any type of personal, intimate relationship, regardless of sexual orientation, marital status, or gender. Like domestic violence, the newer term does not assign the roles of the abuser and victim to one gender or the other, so that's helpful. So defining exposure, that can be seeing, feeling, hearing, being told, becoming aware of injuries afterwards, prenatal exposure, victimization, forced participation, and experiences aftermath. And some of these exposures, as we know, can result in post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. Just as a personal note, for myself, because of some childhood trauma that I experienced, I have a startle response to sharp noises. So that's something that will always be with me. child at risk. 31% of children who witness intimate partner violence report being physically abused themselves. The experiences of racism, prejudice, and discrimination increase children's vulnerability to different kinds of harm when exposed to other risks, such as witnessing intimate partner violence. So for that first bullet, children who witness often are also part of the abuse. And almost half of the children who witness intimate partner violence actively engage in some form of intervention. 49% yelled for the abuser to stop. 43.9% tried to escape. And 23.6% called out for help. Now, what we know about empowering children is that they need to feel heard, to be seen, to be validated. So to be unable to help in a crisis situation can itself be traumatizing. Interviewing and working with children. Now, intervening and eliciting accurate information from children regarding abuse and neglect is a process commonly referred to as forensic interviewing. And for this first bullet, age considerations and appropriate interventions, the interview should be conducted by competently trained, neutral professionals, taking the child's age and development into consideration and using appropriate techniques and approaches best suited for the child. For the second bullet, how trauma affects memory timelines, what that refers to is, regarding memory, age is the most important determinant of a child's capacity for memory. A child's age and developmental abilities influence the child's perception of experiences and the amount of information the child can store and retrieve. Children who have suffered trauma or witnessed violent crime can react uniquely to their experiences. For example, their memories of trauma may be impaired or distorted, and they may not recall their experiences in a linear way. In fact, some may recall their memories more like flashbulbs or snapshots of their victimizations. For this third bullet, space considerations, or where a child might be interviewed, there isn't a whole lot of guidance on what constitutes child-friendly environments, but for the National Children's Alliance, they require that children's advocacy centers or places that would typically be a place where a child would be interviewed, that they should provide child-focused settings that are comfortable, private, and physically and psychologically safe for diverse populations of children and their families. For the fourth bullet, desire to protect, we know that there are dynamics at play, including a child's loyalty and desire to protect a parent or abuser that can inhibit disclosure of the abuse. Resiliency factors. A relationship with a significant adult. So for this first bullet, the connection to a safe, stable, caring person in the community, someone hopefully who will help instill the child in the child a sense of his or her identity or a sense of belonging. For Native children, this is so key, the sense of who he or she is, to who they are in that community. For that second bullet, a sense of hope and promise that there are good things going on in the world and that the child has a right to them. Acquisition of skills and eventually mastery. For example, I'll never forget the look on my granddaughter's face the first time she beat me at a game of Go Fish. I think she was about 4 years old. The fourth bullet, altruism or opportunities for service, helping others, the public good, the community, and not always expecting something in return. And this fourth bullet, locus of control. Now this is a psychological term. This concept is usually divided into two categories, internal and external. If a person has an internal locus of control, that person attributes success to his or her own efforts and abilities. A person who expects to succeed will be more motivated or more likely to learn. A person with an external locus of control who attributes his or her success to luck or fate will be less likely to make the effort needed to learn. People with an external locus of control are also more likely to experience anxiety since they believe that they are not in control of their lives. This is not to say that an internal locus of control is good and an external locus of control is bad. There are other variables to be considered. However, psychological research has found that people with a more internal locus of control seem to be better off. That is, they tend to be more achievement-oriented and seem to get better-paying jobs. Back to intimate partner violence and the legal complications. Intimate partner violence can and often does result in a child welfare case, and the problems come because of what I call the rub between intimate partner violence or domestic violence and child welfare, and that is oftentimes the parent survivor. I try to avoid the term victim because of the stigma associated, and we try to pay attention to stigmatizing language because words have power. And so whenever possible, and I will flub up and maybe use the word battered or batterer, so excuse me if I do. But the survivor oftentimes is alleged to have failed to protect his or her child, and that is oftentimes seen as neglect. And along with that is a child is also then deemed to have been in a circumstance or situation that constitutes witnessing violence. Other problems is in situations such as this, you're punishing the victim or the survivor of the intimate partner violence by removing the survivor's children. Along with that is further traumatization of the children. Foster care placement in and of itself arguably is traumatizing. Regardless of how good that foster home is, that is not the child's home. The child oftentimes, especially the younger the child is, the child doesn't understand what's happened. They might think, what have I done wrong? What's happening to me? I don't understand what's going on. When am I going back? There can be fear on the part of the parent who is being assaulted, that if they do report the abuse, that the children will be removed, and so this can lead to underreporting. So fear of child protection can lead to underreporting of intimate partner violence. In the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization of 2013, there were no protections for children mentioned. So this is a pretty stark example of the silos of that go on, I think, across our systems. I think we're hearing more and more about cross-collaboration and the need for it, and this is a good example of why. One problem I've seen in the years that I've been involved in Indian child welfare, and as an attorney, this has been my specialty area of practice, has been a refusal or a belief that there is a discretion to refuse to implement the protections of the Indian Child Welfare Act by some judges due to safety concerns. Again, on the belief that the Indian Child Welfare Act is optional. I'll give you an example. I've heard of a case where maybe a social worker, in the belief that they were doing what was in the best interest of this Indian child, thought that there were some real safety concerns in a relative's home, and so thought that placing this child in a non-relative, non-native home would be a better bet for this child. And so rather than doing a more thorough background study or safety check of the relative's home, pushed to have this child placed in the non-native home. And what the judge said was, ICWA will have to take a back seat today for the safety of this child. So, you know, I've also heard B.J. Jones, who is a very well-regarded, well-respected scholar and professor, as well as a practicing attorney in the field of Indian child welfare, liken the Indian Child Welfare Act to the hot fudge sundae of laws, in that people think it's sort of like dessert, that it's optional. So that was many years ago that I heard him make that analogy, and I'm thinking that that's maybe on the way out. I certainly hope that it is. I've seen judges, both state court and tribal court judges, come together in ways that were not being done back in those days of the hot fudge sundae metaphor. And I know that there are lots of guidance. There are enhanced bench books, and NCJ, FCJ has been a real leader in this regard in trying to put all of that behind us. U.S. and American Indian history. Now, I really like this this image here, because it shows not an empty continent that Columbus discovered, but one that was indeed populated by lots of native nations, and that's why I chose it. So I'll quickly take you through some of just a bit of what has been the history of American Indian people here in the U.S. We have removal, that is, Native nations who were removed from their original homelands to make way for settlers who had come over from Europe and other places, and then being herded onto reservations. And usually the reservations, as many of you know, were lands that at that time were the undesirable places, or the places that the settlers did not want, some of which were in fact turned out to be places that maybe had oil on them, or other valuable minerals or other things that turned out to be, you know, worth something. So put on reservations and then opened up for allotment. And all of this was during times then that were very difficult for the Native people who were put there. And then boarding schools were opened up and run by missionaries from different congregations. And then the Native children were sent to boarding schools, and we'll spend some time talking about that later on. Termination refers to one of the attempts at assimilation, that is to have Native people become more like the European Americans in their look, in their dress, and in their way of life. So to become less like American Indians and more like European Americans in their values and their way of life, and to terminate reservations and to terminate the American Indian way of life. Relocation is another attempt at assimilation, to relocate off of reservations and into urban areas. My own family participated in the relocation era program. This is also aimed at individual families, individuals from families. So, for example, you could get some money to move to a city, and there were identified relocation cities. If you Google relocation, you can you know, get kind of a handy sort of synopsis about what that is. None of this was really taught in high school or, you know, junior high or middle school programs. So some of this you really have to educate yourself about some of our own history here in the U.S. Indian adoption program went on, you know, adopting American Indian children out of their homes. This is why I think still to today there exists among many American Indians real fear of social workers, that American Indian children will be just adopted out for little to no reason at very high rates back in, all the way going back to when this first began during the boarding school era, termination and relocation. My own home state of Minnesota, we had one of the highest rates of American Indian children being adopted out. And current practices and inherent systemic biases, what that means is judging American Indian families through a non-Indian lens, and judging us based on a white system lens, and to the detriment of American Indian people. And again, hopefully these are things that we are putting behind us. In 2015, we had the Bureau of Indian Affairs guidelines, ICWA guidelines that had not been updated since the 1970s. They were updated, and then the ICWA regulations came out, and those too were updated. And so things are changing, and they are changing for the better. Healing and resiliency. And the reason we have this slide is with all the negative things that have been going on, I think it's very important that you also get a sense of what is positive, what else has been going on that has been good for American Indian people, that has been good both at their own efforts, by their own efforts, and also, I think, in collaboration with others that others have been trying to do to help American Indian people. So one is we have survived, and we have survived with many of our languages intact, and we have done that through language revitalization programs. American Indian movement that, as many of you know, began in the 1960s. Some would say before that. The Wellbriety movement seeks to have sobriety and more through spiritual practices. The Tribal Law and Order Act of 2010 sought to and seeks to stem lawlessness on American Indian reservations and is a way to allow tribal courts to increase some of the penalties that they can impose on not just tribal members, but also on people coming onto their lands who are not tribal members. There are some tribes that have been able to avail themselves of this law. You know, I think one problem, as with anything, any laws that come into effect is, you know, do tribes and others, what capacity do they have to build the infrastructure to enforce the laws and to increase their capacity to deal with the lawlessness and some of the problems that are happening. So, but it's there, the law is there, and once they have the capacity, they certainly are able to avail themselves of it. The Violence Against Women Act of 2013, as I said, there's some protections for crimes that occur on reservations, as I mentioned in the Tribal Law and Order Act. Tribal Self-Determination. American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978 as well. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And that also has its roots in the Tribal Law and Order Act, which was called something else before 2010. Historical context. American Indians have the highest rate of military service per capita than any other group. And the reason I bring this up is if any of you have ever been to a powwow, and if you haven't, I would encourage you to go. One thing you'll notice, as you can see in the image here on your screen, the gentleman is holding what is called an eagle feather staff. Those are eagle feathers. This is very important. It's a very important part of our powwows and our ceremonies. These people are revered. They are our veterans. They are our warriors. Our warriors are highly respected by us. They always have been. They always will be. They are our defenders. And it is no surprise to me that we have the highest rate of military service per capita than any other group. This is our country. This is our country before it was called America or the United States. The irony is that we were not considered American Indians until the Citizenship Act of 1924, also known as the Snyder Act. And at that time, we were called Indians in this act. Now that term Indians is kind of an interesting one, and I've been asked, and I'm sure I will be asked this again, what is the proper term for my answer is, well, you know, I know what I like to be called, but others may have a different answer. My children, for example, prefer to be called Native. I think Native is okay. I find it kind of generic. I prefer American Indian, but I was born in the 60s, and it's more of a politically loaded term, which I kind of like, but that's me. But if you want to be really accurate, what you should call us is by our tribal name. So for me, that would be Lakota. It would be Anishinaabe. So your best bet is to ask the person, what do you prefer to be called? And just know that it's going to differ depending on the Native person or Indian person that you ask. Well, the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution defined as citizens any person born in the U.S. The amendment had been interpreted to restrict the citizenship rights of most Native people. That act was signed into law by President Coolidge on June 2nd, 1924, and it was enacted partially in recognition of the thousands of Indians who served in the armed forces during World War I. Now, the reason I wanted to bring this to your attention is this isn't that long ago. This isn't that long ago. And one thing that I've encountered in my work in Indian child welfare, and I was the Indian Child Welfare Program consultant for years for the Minnesota Department of Human Services. And so I dealt with county social workers, tribal social workers, judges, guardians ad litem. I heard this phrase that mostly I heard from county people, which was, why don't they just get over it? You know, because at that time, and I'm talking like, you know, 10, 15 years ago, the term historical trauma was kind of coming out, and you know, we were hearing about historical trauma, and people were talking about some of the things that Native people were dealing with in terms of you know, alcoholism and poverty, and I think county people were trying to understand, why don't they just get over it and move on? You know, there's a big world and a good life to be had. Why don't they get over it? And I tried kindly to respond to this county social service director. It was a really nice woman. I liked her a lot. We were having lunch, and I said, Lynn, and I said, you know, there are some words that are kind of like little minefields. I said, and that's one of them. I said, they can't just get over historical trauma. I said, and this wasn't that long ago. So when you consider that our warrior tradition, and that this is our country and we love our country, and that we fight for our country, and we've been doing this for how long, and still we haven't been recognized as citizens until 1924, and the irony there, you know, you don't just get over it. So, historical and intergenerational trauma. You've probably seen this picture before, and the reason I think this is kind of visually arresting is just all of these little children looking so much alike, and knowing that before this picture was taken, they all probably looked pretty different in their tribal dress. So the boarding school era, where Indian residential schools were established during the late 19th and mid-20th centuries. And again, I touched on this earlier. The goal was assimilation. And I also touched on the fact that they were started by Christian missionaries of various denominations who often started schools on reservations, especially in the lightly populated areas of the West. Now, my father, as I mentioned, I'm Standing Rock, Lakota. Well, my father is from one of those lightly populated areas of the West. He's from North Dakota. And he told me that my father, incidentally, is not Christianized. He said he doesn't believe much in organized religion. And I think part of that was because he said the missionaries came onto the reservation, and he saw they divided up the reservation. He said one section took, the Congregationalists took one section, the Catholics took one section, and he said the Episcopalians took another. So to him, it didn't make much sense that God would work that way. So just a little story for you. The experience of the schools was usually harsh and often deadly, especially for the younger children who were forcibly separated from their families. The children were forced to abandon their Native American identities and cultures. Investigations of the later 20th century have revealed many documented cases of sexual, manual, physical, and mental abuse occurring mostly in church-run schools. A friend of mine who is Lakota from the Pine Ridge Reservation told me a story. So we were in South Dakota, and she pointed out a spot to me near an old, what was used to be a boarding school that converted the building for some other use. And she said that her great-grandfather set up a teepee so that he could see the building where her grandfather was, and that he stayed camped there for I don't know how long because he missed her grandfather so much. And anyway, that story moved me to tears. I mean, to think that your child could be removed like that for no reason. So these are not super recent statistics, but American Indian and Alaska Native children experience child abuse and neglect at a rate of 16.5 per 1,000 children. The disproportionality rates for foster care placement have increased in the last 10 years, as well as identified human trafficking victims involved with child welfare at some point in their lives. But healing and resiliency, again, that's on the rise. Tribal control of schools and mentoring programs is up. Language revitalization. And societal practices, I think it's important to get a wider view or a wider look too at what was going on in this country, not just with American Indians, but redlining that resulted in American Indian and other non-white communities being discriminated against in housing. The result was the unequal ability to build wealth through owning property and being consigned to segregated areas through laws and violence. So I just think it's important to know this, because some also of what I've experienced in my years of practice in Indian child welfare is this notion, maybe not stated explicitly, but that American Indians and other non-white groups come from cultures of poverty. That is simply not true. It's not in our culture to be poor. It is what has happened to us and what has been taken from us, and it is a result of being marginalized, and it's a systemic practice, and it's such as things as redlining, which of course means that we are purposely being discriminated against and being left out of the so-called American dream. So education was impacted by neighborhood. Funding by states for education was unequal to whites. The condition of schools were poor. The lack of provision to basics such as updated textbooks, the tools needed to learn. And so generations of non-white children were uneducated or undereducated. But healing and resiliency, again, our ceremonial teachings lasted. We are mentoring our youth. There are grassroots efforts against suicide and heroin. There's culture as prevention and programming for youth. And now on to the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978, which we've touched on. Now, ICWA came about as a grassroots effort, and it came about because of what I touched on earlier, which was the removal of Indian children as part of the assimilation efforts that were already well underway. And what had been happening is, again, back to that, looking at Native people through the lens of European Americans and judging us through that lens. Native children were being removed because we were being judged harshly. For example, we were seen as living in conditions that were unfit. Maybe there were a lot of us crowded into a small house, or it wasn't as, the same kind of conditions as maybe someone would have in their own home. And so, people were going to their legislators. They were going to testify, and this was very, very difficult. So you can imagine having to go to a foreign system to pour your heart out, to cry, to say my child was taken. They must have been desperate to do this. And that's why this law came about. So it was designed to remedy mistakes that were made in both federal and state policy and practice that have resulted in Native American children being placed in out-of-home care. And so it requires a higher burden of proof of removal. It requires that caseworkers look beyond the surface. And by that surface means just what I was talking about, meaning looking beyond the surface of what appearances are. How is that child being cared for? Is that child loved? Does that child feel safe? It requires the finding of active efforts to keep that family together, involving extended families and tribes in cases, and a judicial understanding of Native values and tribal sovereignty. And so it's requiring the bench, the judges, to learn, to make an effort to become more versed in American Indian history and their values. The Indian Child Welfare Act allows emergency removal of an Indian child who is off the reservation in order to prevent imminent physical damage or harm. That means that child has to be in a situation where, unless that child is removed, that child is going to suffer damage or harm. The Indian child must be returned home as soon as the threat of imminent physical harm has passed, or the tribal court asserts jurisdiction, whichever is earlier. So if that tribal court wants to have the case transferred, then that child could be returned home if that's what the tribal court believes should happen. Active efforts. Any party seeking foster care placement or termination of parental rights of an Indian child shall satisfy the court that active efforts have been made to provide remedial services and rehabilitative programs designed to prevent the breakup of the Indian family have been made, and that these active efforts have been unsuccessful. Now, active efforts for a long time, I think, were very frustrating because they weren't defined anywhere. Now, these regulations that I mentioned, the VIA regulations that I mentioned earlier, they define active efforts, and this is really helpful. And the way I look at active efforts is they should be concrete examples. For example, when parents are in the child protection system and their child has not been returned to them right away, they have a case plan. They're ordered to work a case plan. So, for example, if the parents' children have been removed because they have chemical use problems, so they have a substance use disorder, or commonly known as addiction, and we're trying to move away from that term. Maybe they're supposed to get a Rule 25, that's what we call it here in Minnesota, but substance use screening. And maybe they've been referred to chemical dependency treatment. So they're supposed to work a case plan. What active efforts would require is that the social worker makes sure that that parent has transportation to get to the appointment, to get their services. Maybe that's a bus pass. Maybe it's the social worker helping get, a ride if the parent has mobility issues. Maybe the parent is in a wheelchair. That's an example, but concrete services to help them get there. In a non-ICWA case, the standard that the county has to meet to get services to the family, to the parents, is reasonable efforts. So active efforts is a higher level of effort that the county has to provide to the family. Now, some folks don't understand why Indian Child Welfare Act cases get this higher level of care or standard of care in terms of trying to prevent the breakup of the family than non-ICWA cases. And I want to explain that real quickly. And for those of you who already know this, please bear with me. Because some folks have asked me, why isn't there, for example, an African American Child Welfare Act? And in fact, there's a lawsuit going on here in my home state of Minnesota to stop the removal of African American children from their homes. And I do not mean in any way to say that there aren't issues around that and that something shouldn't be done. But I think that there are some very serious issues if you're basing it on race, because you run into problems of equal protection. And that is that people who are similarly situated have to be treated the same. And the reason why American Indians can be treated differently or have a higher standard of care, such as active efforts, is because we are not treated differently based on our race. We are treated differently based on our political classification as sovereigns. We are sovereigns because when the Europeans came over to our country, they dealt with us as sovereign to sovereign. We were already nations pre-existing here before the Europeans came over. We are mentioned 3 times in the U.S. Constitution, and so that's why we are treated differently. And anyway, that's your short sort of legal lecture for the day on tribal sovereignty. So that's the problem, and that's why it's different for us. It's not a race-based classification. It's a political classification. Placement. Absent good cause to the contrary, a state court shall follow these preferences for the foster care placement of an Indian child. The first order of preference is with extended family. Now, extended family is auntie, uncle, cousins, grandma, grandpa. I know I've heard it referred to as kin too sometimes. Foster home is the second order of placement licensed by a tribe. Third is Indian foster home licensed by the state. Fourth is an institution approved by the tribe. And the asterisk said these are the preferred placements, and number 5 is only to be used when the others are not available or there's good cause to not follow the preferences. The 5th is other homes licensed by the state. Well, concerns. So survivors of violence may not seek services from professionals, as I said earlier, because of their fear of losing custody of their children if they admit their children witnessed violence. Typically, child protection involvement in cases of children exposed to domestic violence or intimate partner violence has not served the best interests of the children of the survivor of violence. That is, removal from the survivor's care. And though case plans are considered voluntary before adjudication, it doesn't feel like it. Now, what I mean by that is, for example, when a case comes in for an emergency removal, here in Minneapolis, in Hennepin County, it's called an Emergency Protective Care Hearing, or an EPC hearing. And the child is removed on what's called a 72-hour hold. And in that time, a child could be placed with a relative, but the relative would have to pass a background check. Now, in that critical time, that, as we said, we talked about earlier, anytime a child is taken away from the parent, it feels like it is trauma. The parent would have to have some really good evidence to show that what the county is alleging is absolutely false, something that absolutely contradicts what the county is alleging. Because for the most part, on the petition, what's before the judge has to take as true. Now, there have been some cases that I've had where I've been able to get the children returned to the parent, but that's not usually the norm. And so what typically happens is the child will go into a shelter home, and then what the parent does is they are working a case plan to get the child back. What I always would do is I would ask the parent what it is they want to have happen, because the reality is what's going on a lot of times is with the opiate crisis, the heroin crisis, sometimes the parent might be homeless and they are just not in a position to take care of that child, and they just desperately need help to get off the substances that they're on. Tongue-tied here. So I always want to make sure that I'm clear on what it is that they want. But most often, they do want to work a case plan. But in those early stages, before the judge makes a ruling or a finding on that case, before adjudicate, that's what adjudication is, that case is voluntary. But it sure the heck doesn't feel like it's voluntary, because that client, that parent, has the county basically breathing down their neck, watching their every move. So that's why it doesn't feel voluntary. And their whole life is under scrutiny. American Indian and Alaska Native women are more likely to experience intimate partner violence and sexual violence at higher rates than women of other races. Domestic violence and physical and sexual assault are 3.5 times higher than the national average in Native American communities. However, this number may be low, as many assaults are not reported. I'm going to tell you a true story of bifurcated intimate partner violence Indian Child Welfare Act matter. So I was representing this Native woman. I was actually covering for another attorney at this nonprofit ICWA Law Center that I worked at. I stopped working there about just under a year ago because I had to resign because of compassion fatigue. It had just gotten to a point for me where I realized I was feeling sort of irritated a lot, and I asked my husband, how do I do this every once in a while to him, poor guy, but I'll say, so how do I seem to you? Do I seem kind of crabby? And he said, you've been irritated for about the last 6 months. I said, well, why didn't you tell me earlier? He said, well, your work is really important to you, and I know it's important for your community. And I really had to do some soul searching, because as a Native woman myself, I know how crucial this work is, but I also know that burnout is real, compassion fatigue is real, and that sometimes you have to find other ways to be a helper. But anyway, before this happened, I was covering for one of the other attorneys, and the case came, even though she had an open child protection case and had been doing well, she had an incident happen with her partner, and it came in on an EPC, or Emergency Protective Care hearing. And so I went to talk with her in one of the little meeting rooms over at the courthouse. And she was, I'm not very tall myself, I'm about 5'3", and she was about an inch shorter than me, so kind of a little gal. And I got a look at her partner, and he was well over 6 feet tall, and she told me about the incident that happened, and it was one where her 2 teenage daughters, and then she had 2 little ones that were under 5, and he was not the father of the 2 older ones, but she was trying to lock him out of their house because, I don't know, they were in some kind of an argument, and he basically broke the door down, scared the heck out of everybody. The cops came, and the fact that they already had an open child protection case, you know, that just exacerbates everything. And make a long story short, I asked her if she was, I know this sounds like a dumb question, but I asked her if she was afraid of him, and she said, well, yes. And the reason I had to ask that is I can't assume anything, because some of them, meaning my clients, will get mad at you if you say anything against their partner or make any assumptions about them. And I don't want to, I have done that, made that mistake before, and I don't want to do it again. So I always make sure I ask the question, even if it sounds like a dumb one. And what that told me was I could not ask her certain things in open court, meaning where her partner was there, and because she would not be able to answer truthfully. And so it would be difficult. It would be difficult for me to make the case for my client to get what she needed in terms of protection for herself and her children, and for her to get a case plan that she could work, and to get the sympathy of the court and the county in front of her partner. At the same time, not make him angry with her. So you can see what the rub is between child welfare and intimate partner violence cases. So what I did was, I was winging it here because I didn't quite know what to do. I asked to meet in chambers. And what I really like about meeting in chambers, and what that is that the judge and the attorneys go into the judge's chambers, and the social worker and the guardian ad litem, sometimes the social worker, will go in the judge's chambers and talk informally about the case. The clients do not go in there. And you can talk frankly about what's going on. I mean, people will still kind of advocate for their clients, but you can talk frankly. And so I did. And what happened in there, she'll just go back to him, kind of dramatic statement I had there on the second bullet, was what the guardian ad litem said. When I said, you know, I'm concerned, my client is afraid of him, and, you know, I would really like this hearing to be bifurcated, meaning split in two, to have the partner's matter heard separately from mine, so that my client can speak truthfully without fear of reprisal from her partner, so that he won't get mad at her, but she can tell the truth. And the guardian ad litem, who I like, is a nice person, but what's nice got to do with it? She said, she'll just go back to him. And I looked at her and I said, but that's what domestic violence is about. She loves him, and she's in this with him, and she needs help, and she doesn't need to be judged. So So this is what we're dealing with is the judgment of, good intentioned people, but people who need to be trained. And again, that goes to the third bullet that highlights the need for training of important players in the court system. So the upshot of my story is the judge, thankfully, did bifurcate the matter, and my client did get to tell her truth. And, yeah, so that's what happened. Hard realities of Child Welfare Act cases and intimate partner violence cases. Moms are held to a higher standard than dads because they are the presumptive custodial parents. It's common for moms to question why dads are not scrutinized to the same extent as they are, and that they get angry and frustrated as a result, and they distrust the system. And Native people especially distrust the system to begin with. And if substance misuse is present, this can complicate matters. So for example, timely assessments, culturally appropriate services are so crucial. I've mentioned the heroin and opiate epidemics that's going on across the country. And in my community in Minneapolis, this is no different. And the backlog for getting those chemical dependency screenings are really terrible. And I think there's a window of time for people with substance use disorders when they are willing to go in to get help. And if nothing is available and that window closes, that's tragic. And if I don't know, it's really discouraging, and it can render those interventions ineffective. So for the clients, the mothers that question why the dads are not scrutinized to the same extent as they are, it doesn't seem to pacify them much when I point out to them why, that it's really a matter of legalities. It's because, if you were married, it's how the law looks at you. That's how society looks at you. In some ways, it counts in their favor. For example, if the dad wanted to keep the child and didn't want to give the child back, all you'd have to do is show the birth certificate, and you could get the police to pick the child up and bring them back. Which would not be the case if you were married. You would not be able to do that, but that doesn't seem to make them feel much better. Healing and resiliency. Strengthening the cultural bond. Going back to one of the early slides and talking about what is so important for children and feeling connected. This is what I was talking about, and having them feeling like they belong and a sense of their identity. And they can get that through language, being part of that language revitalization, and ceremony. And what does that mean to be part of that whole? And learning about traditional healing practice. And being mentored by an elder. There are mentoring programs. Mentoring by an elder is such a gift. I know that we don't have enough elders, and I think one of the greatest tragedies that I have been aware of is realizing that, one of the greatest poverties that we have is not having enough old people. One of the clients that I had when I was at the nonprofit law center that I worked at, one of the clients I lost to overdose. I went to her wake. She had a wake at a local Native community center, and I was very very saddened because I realized when I went there that I was one of the oldest people there, and I'm in my early 50s. And it just really struck me. You know, most of these young people are here, and they don't know some of the ways that we're supposed to do things when we send someone on their way. Anyway, it saddens me. So mentorship by an elder, we should encourage that, and it really helps to strengthen the cultural bond and encourage that sense of belonging. And participation in tribal government activities, helping to build skills and community involvement, because being connected to tribal culture promotes resiliency more than anything else. A true story of trauma and survival, and I really hope you enjoy this.
1 in 3 Native women will be sexually assaulted. And that's just the reported assaults. There are so many more that will never go reported. I am the one of 3. I was only 6 years old when someone I trusted began violating my body. I lost my innocence that day, that moment it began. It silenced me for months. I withdrew into myself, and to this day, I still have trouble finding the courage to genuinely be myself. At 15, I swallowed a bottle of painkillers prescribed to me with no intention of waking up again. I had cuts carved into my arms when I was admitted to the hospital. Many don't understand the amount of power depression has over the mind. It had taken my soul by force and completely tore me apart. I looked into my future, and I saw none. I had fallen so deep into darkness that I saw there was no way out except escaping. I almost became one of the negative statistics that others use to define my community. Recovering, I was forced to piece myself back together at 15, and I found my way through prayer and my culture. I began going to traditional ceremonies more and talking to Tunkashila, which is the Lakota language for the Creator. I owe my healing to my culture, to my people. I found my strength through the love of my family and the power of my spirituality. I was faced with depression and suicide all while in high school, which is a hard time for many. The low graduation rate amongst Native Americans is apparent in all our minds while going through school. I went to high school knowing of the expectation that I would drop out. But I beat that statistic and graduated from high school with a full ride scholarship to college. I started college knowing of the expectation that I wouldn't make it through. But I am now in my 3rd year, almost done with my bachelor's degree. Although the work is rigorous, I have been exposed to many different backgrounds and ideas. I have met friends and professors who continue to encourage me and push me, even on my bad days. This past school year, I have had some especially awful days. I was raped by a complete stranger. Who wounded my already damaged heart once again. There are days when I feel as though I have made all this progress to be brought back to 6 years old again, when a piece of my being was ripped away from me. But then there are some mornings when I wake up and I feel happy, and I feel strong, and I have hope. I am 20 years old, and I am still struggling to be completely whole again, but I find strength in knowing that I always have my reservation, my Lakota way to turn to on the days I do struggle. I know that I am never alone, and I always have someone to call. I go back to the reservation, and I am surrounded with love and laughter. We find medicine through laughter, and so I can always count on feeling cheered up when I go home. The happiness that we find through going home is often never spoken about, yet the daunting statistics facing Native American communities are common knowledge. It's easy to read numbers on a screen or a piece of paper, but more often than not, you won't hear about or even think of the real stories or people behind these numbers. Pictures have been posted in magazines, and they depress me every time I look at them. Where are the pictures of the beautiful Black Hills and Badlands in every direction? Where are the photos of us walking out of a sweat lodge, purified and peaceful? You haven't heard all our voices singing in perfect harmony as we pray to our ancestors for our families and friends. The depth and beauty of our culture is mesmerizing, and I am so blessed to live this way of life. This generation, my generation, has felt the negative statistics and prejudices weighing heavily on our shoulders throughout our entire lives. Certainly, I have seen friends suffer through depression, the loss of friends, addictions, and worse. I have held my sister as she cried when she lost her friend to suicide, just as I did a few years before her. I have cried for my family members who could never break free of their addictions. But I have also hugged my classmates when we graduated from high school, so excited for our bright futures ahead of us. The path I walked has humbled me, and I look back on what I have experienced, and I am grateful. I have infinite support from my close family who continue to build me back up when I don't have the strength to do so myself. And my journey doesn't end here. When I graduate with a degree in secondary education, I will go back home to the reservation to teach. And I plan on incorporating our language and culture into my classroom to emphasize the importance of how we're a unique and beautiful people. One by one, we are breaking through the low bar of expectations the media and America's founders have set for us. We are facing the problems of our people head on. More and more Native Americans are going to college and using their higher education to help their community.
I would encourage, if you wanted to watch the rest of it, I know Patricia posted the link here, but this is such a worthwhile YouTube video to watch. It really struck me because this young woman articulates so well, I think, the frustration of our youth and having the negative or downer statistics is what I look at it as of Native people, that we are, I think, sort of depicted as people always needing help. Again, going back to what I talked about as this culture of poverty, or losers, or any negative stereotype you can think of. But just that, sort of like I hate that image of the defeated warrior on a horse. I've always hated that image, or the romanticizing, or that we're not always changing, evolving. It's that we're not vibrant. So I love this video because she really sort of tosses that away and talks about who we are really, and having to deal with, going against that and triumphing over it the way she's done. So I encourage you to look up that video and listen to her whole story because it's well worth it. Recommendations. So we need better protocols to screen for children exposed to intimate partner violence and other family violence that can be used in many settings, such as health care, education, mental health, family services, and the criminal justice system. We need improved interventions to assist exposed children and safety planning targeted at children's safety. We need evidence-based therapeutic programs to help children cope. We need increased parent mentoring programs to help strengthen parenting skills and the parent-child bond. One thing that we have going here in Minneapolis, and I know that there's also some of this happening in other states, is we have a parent mentoring program for child protection involved parents. So at the Indian Child Welfare Law Center where I used to work, we have parent advocates and parent mentors. So for those parents who want them, in addition to the social workers, the child protection social workers, we would have advocates who were housed on staff at the Indian Child Welfare Law Center who would work with them as well to help provide support. Maybe that's a text to them each day, how are you doing? What can I do to help you? Do you want me to come with you when you're meeting with your therapist? It might be to help give them a ride somewhere. I think some of the problems that, as in any helping profession that you have to be aware of is you have to be aware of your boundary or what's appropriate to the relationship, especially if you're dealing with someone who is trying to overcome a substance use disorder, because you don't want to engage in any kind of inappropriate assistance or helping. So that's some of the things that our advocates and our parent mentors have to be aware of. But other than that, a lot of what they've learned, especially the parent mentors, and we do have one who herself had been a heroin user and had a child removed and was in, child protection and came out on the other side, had her child returned to her and became a parent mentor. So she speaks from experience, and I think, she's an incredibly effective parent mentor. So I think that they can be the ones who can be most helpful of all. More recommendations. Increased efforts to coordinate services between adult and child victims and witnesses. Culturally appropriate prevention programs to reduce the amount of family violence to which children are exposed. School-based education, parenting education, and public awareness campaigns. I know culturally appropriate prevention programs to reduce the amount of family violence to which children are exposed is something that some tribes have been involved in. I myself had been involved in with the Rocky Boy Chippewa Cree tribe in north central Montana, the Children Exposed to Violence Project. That's something that they had been involved in, is reducing childhood exposure to violence, and they did that as a cross-collaboration with programs on their reservation, and that was their domestic violence program, and that was their child welfare department, and it was also their law enforcement department, and also their school advocates. So it's bringing all of those programs together and trying to work together. And I think for people outside of tribal programs, the assumption can be about tribes that because they're smaller that they all know what's going on with each other, or that would be easy for them to work together. And maybe that's true for some folks, but for the tribes that I've worked with, that's not necessarily the case. It can be, difficult, and in some cases, because they're smaller, they're wearing multiple hats. So in some ways, it's more difficult for them. Other suggestions? So I'm wondering if folks have questions or have comments for me. I would be happy to take them. We've got a little bit of time. Looks like someone is typing. Why is sexual abuse toward women and children disproportionately higher among Native Americans? This is not part of their culture, is it? That's a good question. Why is it higher among Native Americans? From what I understand, the folks who are the perpetrators of the violence against Native women and children are not Native themselves. So those who are doing the violence against us are not Native. So that's an interesting thing. Is there a place, or are there any statistics where I can refer to for domestic violence and child abuse among Native Americans? Let's see. I am going to refer you to a book called The Beginning and End of Rape by Sarah Deer. Now that's about rape against American Indian women, but she is a scholar, a well-known scholar, and she is Native American herself. But yeah, I would start there. And looks like we've got some other folks typing. Legal aid service providers can provide a lot of resources as well as services. Thank you for that, Sharon. Lucy Hudson, High Care Center. Are things getting better or worse? Okay, I'm having kind of a hard time. My font is flipping down here. It's not our experience that abuse perpetrators are non-Native. Are there good statistics anywhere? How do we engage a community to accept that domestic violence, child neglect, and abuse affects everyone and is a responsibility of the community and not just one person or organization? How do we engage a community to accept that domestic violence, child neglect, and abuse affects everyone and is a responsibility of the community and not just one? Okay, why don't I take this one first? Are things getting better or worse? I think it depends on what you mean by things getting. I mean, it's kind of a broad question. I guess I think things are getting better in that there's more attention being paid to the problem. I know that in my community here in Minneapolis, we're having a lot more events being paid to missing and murdered Indigenous women events, but they're getting worse in terms of the depredations and the violence against Native women. I don't know if you heard about the case that happened about a year ago against a young Native woman from North Dakota by the name of Savannah, where she went upstairs in her apartment building to help a neighbor who said they needed help with some sewing project. And in fact, what they did was they basically stole her baby from her body. She hadn't given birth yet. It was the most heinous crime imaginable. And so in that way, I mean, these crimes are occurring and they're unbelievable. So things are still unbelievably bad. I think that things are getting better, as I said, just in terms of social media. I mean, say what you will about social media, and I certainly am not a fan of some of the ways it's being used and maybe how our children are being socialized in terms of not having conversations or the social skills that they're not using or conversing with us as adults as we would like. But I do think that they are being used in an effective way to draw attention to some problems. So I think that that's a really good way of that they're being used to draw attention to things like injustice. So I think things are getting better that way. It looks like Patricia just posted something about the special DV criminal jurisdiction under the TED Talk video. Pat, you said that it's not your experience that abuse perpetrators are non-native. Are there good statistics anywhere? You know, I would have to look into that, and I can't remember off the top of my head where I read that most perpetrators are non-native, but I remember when I was at the American Indian Alaska Native Task Force on reducing childhood exposure to violence, that's where I heard that, but I will certainly try and dig those up and provide those to any attendees here after this presentation. How do we engage a community to accept that domestic violence and child neglect and abuse affects everyone and is a responsibility of the community and not just one person or organization? I think that you can call a town hall or a community forum and you engage community leaders. And I think it can be a grassroots type meeting. I don't think it has to be something where it has to be, you know, dignitaries or anything like that. I think it can be just a conversation where you get people together. And if you have food, if you have someone to watch the little ones, if you have a way for folks to get there, for grandmas to get there, or for someone to watch the, like I said, the little ones, I think that you make it accessible for folks. I know that that's what's been a problem in engaging the community, the Native community here is, you know, how do you make it so that it's easy for folks to come? If you've got grandmas watching grandchildren, you know, because the parents are struggling with their substance use disorders or they're just not around, how is it that you make it able for them to attend, to be present, you know, and how do you feed people? So here's some. This resource has a lot of good citations around violence against American Indian and Alaska Native women. Thank you, Mari Foster. Some of the citations are on the older side, but we have to know where we come from. Yes, this is true. All right, let's see if I missed anything. I don't know if folks can scroll up. This is, okay, here we go. All right. Do we have any other questions or comments? Okay, we have someone typing. Does chemical addiction play into the sexual abuse issue? Well, I don't have any statistics at my fingertips, but I would have to say yes. I think bad decisions are made when you are dealing with a substance use disorder. And so, I would have to say yes. I think that substance use disorder and mental health, those are usually co-occurring disorders. And when you have those two things going on, you have bad decisions being made. So yes. And I think we have one more person typing, and then I think we will go ahead and say goodbye. So we'll see what Ms. LaPlante is typing. Are cultural plans used by judges as part of adoption court cases today? That's a good question, and I think sometimes they are. I think especially if you have so-called open adoptions, where there is a plan to maybe have bio families still involved. And for example, I've been involved in cases where I have wanted to make sure if my client, for example, is giving up legal custody of a child, that they would still have the right to visit or to have access, that child is still going to have access to that cultural heritage. I've also, when I was a tribal judge and there was a customary adoption, which was a tribal adoption, that was very much a part of it, the cultural plan or that cultural heritage, that birthright of that child. So that's an excellent question, Kathy. Thank you. So the answer is yes, and some of them there are. And the cultural plans seem to be a good solution to placement issues. I would agree with you there. So, well, I want to thank each and every one of you for being on this webinar and for listening to me. I hope that you learned something, and I hope that as you go on in your work, and I'm assuming that you are a helper, that that you've taken something from today in your learning, and I wish you good luck and continue on good path and good feelings in your work. Miigwech.